IPD is a Canadian nonpartisan think tank dedicated to promoting ideas that support diplomacy, constructive engagement, and prudent realism in international affairs. Back in 2017, the Liberal government in Canada released its defense policy, Strong, Secure, Engaged. In the policy, the government announced plans to modernize Canada's armed forces, to be strong at home, secure in North America, and engaged in the world. Committed to boosting Canada's defense policy by $553 billion over the next 20 years, SSE will increase the size of the Canadian Armed Forces, affirm Canada's unwavering commitment to its longstanding alliances and partnerships, and provide new investments to ensure our troops have the modern tools they need to be successful in and returning home safely from operations. However, since 2017, the world's rules-based order has undergone a transformation that has reawakened hard power politics, pure competition, and the seizure of territory as prevalent traits in security architectures. Best captured in the early days of 2020, the world witnessed war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the India-China border skirmishes, to today's growing Sino-US great power competition, Beijing's growing hostility towards Taiwan, and its increased militarization of the South China Sea, and America's push for maritime ententes with like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the Quad and AUKUS, North Korea's ongoing nuclear proliferation, to the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war. In response to these shifts, Ottawa announced reactionary investments to its defense posture, ranging from the decision to purchase 88 F-35 fighter jets, a $7.3 billion upgrade to its fighter jet bases, a $38.6 billion investment over the next 20 years to modernize NORAD, and commitments to reinforce a Canadian-led battle group in Latvia as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence. Despite these investments, pivoting Canada's defense posture in the right direction, there are worries from some that Canada remains restricted and unprepared to project force to defend, advance, and attain its national interests for security and defense, along with fulfilling its commitments to allies and partners, and to deter aggression from those who seek to erode Canadian autonomy and sovereignty in key geosecurity peripheries like the Arctic, the Indo-Pacific, and across North America. To assist in the discussion today and shed light on Canada's defense policy update, I have three distinguished panelists. First, I have Ian Mack. He is a retired Rear Admiral with the Royal Canadian Navy. After a 38-year-long career with RCN, Ian served for a decade with a portfolio of projects in the Department of National Defense, including the National Shipbuilding Strategy, 3 shipbuilding projects, and 4 vehicle projects for the Royal Canadian Navy and Canadian Army. Since leaving the government, he has offered his shipbuilding and project management perspectives nationally and beyond. Ian is a fellow with the International Center for Complex Project Management, the World Commerce and Construction Association, and the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He is also an executive associate of Strategic Relationships and Solutions. Next, we have Renee Filiatru. Renee has served 3 ministers of national defense for Canada and was heavily involved in the development of Strong, Secure, Engaged from 2015 to 2017. She is a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and sits on the board of the CDA Institute, as well as the Network for Strategic Analysis out of Ottawa and Queen's University. From 2009 to 2010, she served as a Foreign Service Officer in Afghanistan with Task Force Kandahar and is accredited with Information Operations Battlefield Officer Training. She has received the Operational Service Medal for Southwest Asia, the General Service Medal for Afghanistan, and the Commander Joint Task Force Afghanistan Commendation while in theater. Renee is a regular commentator on defense and security matters. Lastly, we have retired Lieutenant General Steve Bowes. Having served in a variety of positions and locations at home and deployed abroad, holding commanding appointments at every rank, Steve has extensive command and staff experience in joint operations as a general officer. Notably, he served a second tour in Afghanistan in 2009 as Deputy Chief of Staff Plans in the ISAF Joint Command and commanded the Canadian Army Doctrine and Training Center before assuming the strategic foresight analysis responsibilities of the Chief of Force Development at NDHQ in Ottawa. Promoted to Lieutenant General in 2015, he assumed command of the Canadian Joint Operations Command. Following his retirement in 2020, Steve is a senior mentor with the Canadian Security Program at the Canadian Forces College in Toronto. Welcome, everyone.
Great to be here.
I'm sure you all will remark that the SSE is an intriguing policy, seeing as it's the first defense policy from the Liberal government and the successor to the Canadian First Defense Security of Stephen Harper from 2008. I would also be remiss to stipulate that it is also Canada's first attempt to launch a defense policy for the post-9/11 war on terror in the unipolar era. Thus, I'm interested to get this discussion started by asking the following question to each of you. Is Canada's existing defense policy strong, secure, engaged? sufficient to safeguard Canadian security and defense interests at home and abroad in the seemingly more hostile multipolar global order? Ian, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Andrew, and hello, everyone. So I'm going to answer by saying no, but not for the reason you would probably expect. SSE states it's particularly or deliberately ambitious, and it surely was in terms of aspirations. Yet, one of the concerns I've had over defense policies for a long time is the failure at the same time as government approves a defense policy to also approve a detailed implementation plan. And once again, what we have found is with 340 projects between SSE and 2 budgets and the additional 6 or 7 announced since, we have a huge number of projects to try to move through. And as the quote goes, vision without execution is just hallucination. So I am no expert in the combat and the many projects that it considered. And they did all kinds of work around costing, I will admit, which is great. But they also suggested that correctly, this would only be possible with a 6-part procurement renewal plan. And you will probably know, some of you, that my last 10 years in particular, was spent in procurement on steroids. And when you look at the 6 themes, I think we're in trouble. And I just want to touch on them. Reduced D&D departmental approval time by 50%. General, you may recall the last time we tried to do that, we actually increased the amount of time spent approving projects in D&D by 20%. Increase D&D's contracting authority to $5 million. I doubt very many dollars. Increase transparency with industry and the public, with regular updates on major projects and challenges. I have seen none of that. And in a risk-averse democratic government, like most democratic governments, we have not seen where we have gotten to in moving 340 projects. Strengthen the D&D procurement workforce by growing numbers, advanced training, professional accreditation, and a rebalancing of HR between the military, civilian, and industry components. Well, we've been waiting for that to happen forever. The reality is, recently reported, the Assistant Deputy Minister material that has to move all this has 30% vacancies as we speak. And if that's true, then there will be no free labor for advanced training, accreditation, more professionalization, etc. And oh, by the way, defense policy doesn't mean Treasury Board, PSPC, or ISCDC are going to have additional capacity to move what D&D might wish to move. The 5th one that's mentioned is harnessing new technologies and leveraging new ways of doing business. What's missing is a commitment by government to accept the risks with trying new business methodologies. And the 6th theme is aligning innovative R&D in the Canadian defense industry with flexible new procurement mechanisms to test and then procure sole source the most promising of those ideas. For the last 2 decades, we've been trying to do this. We have actually done pilots, and it has been shut down either by the broader Canadian industry government grievances or by the risks involved in what effectively becomes a very complex industrial policy. I haven't talked a lot about the fact that every one of those 340 projects also has an in-service support piece to that, which is almost a separate project that has to be put in place with industry. Nor have I touched upon Budget 2023, which has a number of reductions which are going to kick in. And anyone who doesn't think that's going to affect D&D and projects writ large is dreaming in Technicolor. So I'll leave you with two more quotes for this section. Policy and vision are just aspirations looking for projects to implement them. And in such a rapidly changing, complex, and interconnected global commons, policy implementation must be timely or it is irrelevant. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Ian. Before we go off to our next panelist, I just want to let all the attendees watching know that if you'd like to submit any questions, please do so through the Q&A box. I will be moderating and inspecting the questions for our audience question portion near the end. I'd like to now shift it to Renee. Having been working on the SSE and obviously seeing what has come of it, and then seeing the geopolitical environment kind of shift in terms of what was actually inside the document, what are your thoughts on the existing policy and how it shapes up to secure our interests for security and defense?
Well, picking up on what the Admiral said about it's nothing if it doesn't have vision, I mean, that's correct. And I would second his point on the importance of implementation. And when we undertook to, and you've done a beautiful off-the-top job of painting a wildly evolved strategic geopolitical framework today versus 2015 when we undertook the defense policy. Just to touch a little bit on that, when we undertook to do the defense policy, it was very clear to us that we needed to go back and look at the 2005 defense policy statement and Canada First, because consistently in Canada, we've seen defense policies sort of die on the vine or calcify because, you need vision, you need resources. Otherwise, you're just cutting your coat based on how much cloth you have. And you need, to Admiral Mack's point, implementation, incredibly critical. So it was really clear to us when we came in that we needed to do a clear national assessment of the condition of the Canadian Armed Forces and to do an international assessment on what those resources would be used for. And it was an enormous undertaking. This wasn't a siloed version of a defense policy statement like we saw with 2005. And it wasn't intended to be a time-stamped policy, like the Canada First, where you saw notations, for example. It was really notable to us that you saw notations to, defending Canada during the Olympics. And so we had to ensure that it was doctrine, that we talked about concept of operations, but also that it was forward-looking and agile. And we spoke to a lot of our allies about this. We went to Australia, the UK, and they gave us some great advice. Along with, for example, suggesting that we have a panel report directly to the minister that included, in our case, we included Bill Graham, a former defense minister. We included a former chief defense, Margaret Purdy, master on national security machinery of government, and of course, Louise Arbour. We brought them on because we saw defense policies consistently die on the vine. So that corporate memory that they brought to the table was critical. One of the things that we didn't do that Australia suggested was a fifth member to be an expert on procurement and defense. Basically, they called it sort of an industry expert. And we didn't take that advice. Politically speaking, it wouldn't be remotely viable or defendable to have an industry expert, as part of that panel. We would have been, I believe, lambasted for that, accusations of collusion. And that's really unfortunate in my mind, because industry, no question, is a key part of this discussion because they are that implementation side. And I think it would have been valuable to have that input. Now, we did a huge costing exercise, again, brought in an outside consultant that other nations have done to mimic Canada. So, so in some cases, we had some really good work done. Obviously, the consultation period was real and in depth. I mean, it was a real 24/7, every day of the week endeavor at National Defense. I mean, Admiral or General Bose can speak to the fact that there were meetings every other day, and then every day, and sometimes on Sundays. And it wasn't just a few people in the room. ADM Paul typically has the pen on a defense policy. In this case, it was the CDS, the DM, the associate DM, the minister, all of the level ones, the heads of branches, and D&D at the table, cracking this out, and in order to embed it and synchronize it within the machinery of government. So it had the vision, and I believe at the time, the trying to address the ongoing concern for limited implementation was a battle cry the entire time, particularly from the DM, John Forster. And I'll sort of end on this because I know we're going to come back to it, but it's very instructive to me that when, the DM, the CDS, and the minister appeared before committee to speak to the defense policy, the MPs very predictably were, hammering on about resource. Is this enough money? Is it enough money? Is it enough money? And John Forster, the DM of the day, said, it is. We've costed this out, and this is what we think this will cost, and this is what we think we need. My larger concern is how fast or how quickly or efficiently we can spend that money. I am concerned for that. And that's speaking directly to that battle cry that we were constantly vigilant of. We tried to address that with things like the Defense Investment Plan and trying to push procurement. But and I'm sure we'll come back on this, but as Admiral Mack said, there is a very risk averse element in the civil political CAF industry environment that I think doesn't serve Canada well. And I think I'll leave it there. I know we're going to come back on it. I will say this to be a bit more optimistic as a final point. Nobody should be surprised that we're having a defense policy update. At the time, again, part of not letting the defense policy calcify was addressing that list of things you're talking about, Andrew, the changing geopolitical environment. You have to continuously update that vision. And we spoke publicly about the fact that about every 10 years, we're going to have an update. I mention that because recently I've heard some refrain and some people thinking it's a bit of a surprise. Maybe in the building, the timing of announcing it connected with the budget last year was a surprise, which shows a bit of a concerning disconnect between D&D, CAF, and the political level. But there was always an intention to do a defense policy update, and I think they're critically important. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Renee, for your insightful comments. Steve, we'll move to you. Having an extensive career with the Canadian Armed Forces, I'm sure you've had your fair share of different policies, different white papers coming out during your service. So, can you kind of build off of what was previously said, or do you have a different interpretation of what the policy is?
I have some slight differences, but on the whole, I think you'll find my comments reinforcing. The issue isn't with the policy. If you look at the document and you take the ambition, the aspirations, and put it into the context of the world as we knew it then and as we know it today, there's not so much issues with that. It's the implementation very much. As the Admiral, as Ian pointed out, and Renee a little bit later pointed out, and what we were recommending right off the bat was a strategy document that would enable us to go forward and enable the L1s. So those are not just services, but other capability developers inside the department and inside the forces to be able to deliver on strong, secure, and engaged, the policy. But that strategy document didn't get traction. So without that, you can't develop the implementations plans in the proper context. And without that, you lose the ability to have accountability. And that's, one great, you can't deliver your outcomes, but you also lose the ability to have accountability. So perhaps from a political standpoint, we can understand why it was difficult at the very beginning. Because I would say the enthusiasm for the release of the document and the policy in 2017 began to wane very, very quickly. and into 2018 as we realized that we weren't going to be able to develop all the supporting architecture to deliver it. The enthusiasm clearly dropped away. I want to point out, though, that to echo particularly what something Renee said, broad consultation. In fact, some of the groundwork for this began even before my tenure in 2014 as Chief Force Development. It was recognized that we would be needing to do something. So my predecessor as Chief Force Development released a document, Future Security Environment, the last time it's been actually released. And it was the first document that the Blue Ribbon panel read, and were brought into, a number of folks were brought in to talk about what was going on in the world as we saw it. And it's very important just to remember that although we're doing a policy update today, there's almost nothing that has happened in the world since 2017 that wasn't foreseen before. That includes the pandemic, and I'll get to that. Not the pandemic that we lived, but the possibility of a pandemic. It was all out there. Xi took power in China in 2012. The elements of political warfare, Chinese strategic thought, were fully evident by 2014. Russia did not invade Ukraine in 2022. It invaded in 2014, took Crimea, phase 1, moved into the Donbass, phase 2. Phase 3, last year, yes, far more significant scale, obviously, but this has been a graduated development for which when I was Commander of CJOC, many commanders along the eastern side of NATO were outlining that it wasn't going to end just with Crimea and the Donbass. And in fact, one particular general, what he told me, the playbook is almost exactly what happened. And I continue to reflect back on that experience. I would also say that, when we begin to look at other elements, CJOC was working on a contingency plan for a pandemic response, part of the regular update in 2016. And Bill Gates' TED Talk that he gave in 2016 landed a transcript on my desk about 2 weeks after that. So the input that went in to the document, to the entire process was sound, it was broad, it was consultative, it was quite remarkable in the level of engagement. And to Renee's point, the senior leaders that were involved and schedules changed quite late and said, this is your new number one priority for the next 24, 48 hours is to give us your feedback on this particular piece of the document, happened regularly. So it was broad. But what I would say, when you're talking about a policy update now, it's important to recognize that what is the government really signaling? Is it considering a rewrite in light of what's going on in the world? No, it's considering to say, whoa, so it's not what's driving the update. The policy in itself might be sufficient, but it's driven by a necessity for reflection. Some considerable things changed, and it has more to do with our understanding of what we could do or wanted to do and maybe didn't want to really do in light of the document. And so it comes down to how much political capital are we willing to invest now, and how much political will are we willing to invest to achieve elements within this policy framework, and what things need to change relative to priorities that we saw in 2017. Notwithstanding rather cheery reception around the POTUS, the President of the United States' recent visit here, there was no doubt some back channel conversations about the timelines for modernizing NORAD. There have been very clearly opinions expressed about Canada's ability to deliver towards NATO. So the government is clearly taking these into reflection within context of the broader issues in the light that it's going to be tested at the polls in a couple of years or less. So I think that, you could summarize it is that finally people recognize no more sunny ways. No more sunny ways. This, you can't frame anything around that. That entire outlook has been set aside, and there's a reality that's in play now. Where that leads us, not sure. Another point out I would actually say is that, when we talk about it, Ian used the term hallucination. There's an old term, another one, a vision without resources is a hallucination. And this really comes down to how much resources are we willing to expend to actually implement elements of the defense policy. And resources are not just constrained to or are limited to money. It's people, it's capacity, it's bandwidth, it's Treasury Board, the broader government architecture, it's all of that. And so I think that that's really where, when they talk about an update now, They're really trying to take stock of all the pressures that are in play and figure out what we can do, what we should do, what maybe we just want to do, you know, as a government, and take it from there. I'll hold off on that point and prepare for the next bound.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. The inclusion of modernization and then the political will and then your last point specifically of where Canada wants to go, what it wants to do, is perfect because it ties into the second question I would like to ask each of you. And that's within SSE, there is heavy attention towards the modernization of the Canadian Armed Forces. In particular, to showcase Ottawa's strategic vision for defense that makes it strong at home, secure in North America, engaged in the world. However, can Canada realistically have 3 modernized branch services in lieu of shrinking military personnel, domestic, industrial, and technological constraints, and the cost of resources required to fully make each branch service combat ready and multi-purpose as it's put in the policy? Or should there be a prioritization for modernizing one branch service reinforced by a supplementary branch to better equip Canada with the capabilities it needs to, one, defend its national interests, but also to carry out its extra-regional commitments, whether that be with NATO, with NORAD, or the growing center of gravitational shift towards the Indo-Pacific, to the Indo-Pacific. And the reason why I want to focus on this very specifically is that it reinforces the point made by Norm Augustine, who is a U.S. aerospace businessman who served as United States Undersecretary of the Army. And he developed what's known as Augustine's Law, and that's the increasing cost of new and modern weapons is such that in future, as taken by one plane, one tank, one ship. And so if we're going with that kind of perspective, is it practical and realistic for Canada to modernize all 3 of its services for a more hostile geopolitical order? Renee, we'll start with you.
That's an interesting question. Prioritizing one branch over the other, or over the other 2. I would say that would be a internal to NDHQ and an internal to the CAF. That would be like throwing a stake at a 3-headed dragon, asking branches to prioritize one over the other. And there's a reason for that, because they're all incredibly relevant and required in the current context of threat. Increasingly so, threat has become more interrelated, not less. Particularly if you look at cyber, if you look at below the threshold gray zone threats, as they call it, that the UK Defense Secretary brilliantly called that limbo place between peace and war threat that we all are experiencing almost on a daily level with the Chinese balloons and everything else. That takes a coordinated, all perils perspective of threat and response from the branches. The second thing I would say is that so much of this is about deterrence, and deterrence is more is partly being able to say, don't make us come over there. And all 3 branches need to be aye ready at any moment to respond. And that's part of, when we do our forward presence mission in Latvia, along with other nations and the eastern flank, it's not that we're going to it's not that we're going to go after the Russians. It's that we're standing with Latvia and our NATO allies looking at Russia saying, don't come over here, because we're standing right here with our partners in solidarity. That's the power. So deterrence is incredibly dependent on all branches being supported and solid, and increasingly so, I believe. The second to final point I'll make on this is that, we have treaty obligations. So we have NORAD obligations, we have NATO obligations. And one of the things that really surprises me sometimes when I hear the dialogue and debate about NORAD, for example, I heard a very senior journalist say, I understand, and it was in the middle of the Chinese balloon coverage. And he said, I understand that we help the Americans protect our airspace sometimes, but that's how he started. And that is a misread of what our role and responsibility in NORAD is. It is the world's only binational command. And, you kind of see it very succinctly when you watch a Canadian general report to the president, and you watch, an American general report to the prime minister. Truly binational. The only, this is a bit tactical, but the only joint prep session for a press conference I ever did was in Colorado Springs with our American counterparts. And I was briefing the American Secretary of Defense, and my partner in the Pentagon was briefing my minister, because we were going out as a team. Those treaty obligations mean that we have to be ready. And in NORAD, for example, I was very nervous between 2015 and 2019 by the allergic reaction to talking about modernizing NORAD, reassured to see that we were putting the fact that the discussions were beginning in the defense policy. Obviously, there's been joint statements, there's been announcements since, and that's been reassuring. But, I would say something sobering in that, when we are buying jet fighters, we're buying 88. And that includes our NORAD and NATO obligations. The Americans are buying, for the same obligations, 2,456. And an American colonel told me the other day, actually, it's more now, Renee. And so, we have the same obligations. If, a Russian bear starts playing silly games, a fighter's going to scramble. It's going to be a Canadian fighter. It's going to be an American fighter. The requirements of our treaties are the same, and that includes on the high seas, it includes land, and it includes air. So it would be very hard to prioritize one branch over the other. I don't know. I would almost be extremely curious to see what an Army general like Steve Bose or a Navy admiral like Ian Mack would say to that question.
Perfect, Renee. Well, we're going to have the opportunity. Steve, with your experiences, obviously in Afghanistan, you were up front and center with, the multi-domain of warfare specifically at that time. So what are your thoughts? Is modernization for all the branch services practical, and it's what's needed in the modern kind of multipolar era where, like Renee said, we have multiple obligations, and then we also have our national interests protecting the well-being, the safety of Canadians. So what would be your insight and your kind of perspective on things?
Well, modernization, of course, but first I'm going to just tackle it. Three branching services, we wouldn't talk that way. We wouldn't use those terms, and anybody that came to walk into the conversation at Armed Forces Council Executive, where the 3 stars meet with the 4 star, would be pilloried. So we talk about capabilities through domains of warfare and conflict, and there are at least 5 domains of warfare. Rennie talked about them, and you could add the informational domain, which is still, the thought around that is maturing. But so we would talk about capabilities within each domain. Some of them come from a single service, so as a force generator or the capability developer. Some of them come from multi-developers. And so you really have to, just sort of accept that. In terms of the domains of warfare, we're going to continue to modernize in all domains. Whether we do it proportional or whether we give into priorities of select capabilities, well, that's very different. And you can think about the air domain as an example. NORAD may get priority over, expeditionary operations, in terms of the kind of capabilities that are associated with both within the air domain. And think of it that way. I can't foresee a circumstance where you leave one of the major force developers that would end up saying, well, so we won't modernize the Army, and therefore we won't bother. We'll tell NATO we won't be able to commit to Latvia-style missions, and what we did in Ukraine and what we're now doing to support that require professional leadership cadres based on the elements, the building blocks within the force generators. That's just inconceivable. And I think it'll come to us, a little bit later in the conversation, because I don't think we're quite to the point where we can say we have a finite level of resources. We haven't really figured out what Canada is going to be willing to pay, or in my theory, those conversations behind, they were chummy in front of the camera, but behind the scenes, there was probably some very pointed talk about where we're at now in real dollars. The Globe and Mail editorial board pointed out that we're spending less on defense now than what we did 5 years ago when SSE was rolled out. So there's some really hard conversations going along with allies and with conveying expectations, but doing it privately, professionally. And therefore, when you just think of it that way, and you look at the scenarios for which the government under SSE approved to say, these are the kind of things that we envision the Canadian forces doing in the future, therefore, all of them are going to continue to be modernized, but to a faster or a slower extent, to a greater or lesser extent, that may be determined. But I'll leave it there. But you know what? I just one point. The limitation factor in all this, and it's something that we really haven't teased out yet, is people. And, you know, the one part of SSE that wasn't completely costed, all of it was, you know, costed to what you saw out in the public, but they were working years ahead before even before the idea of having the defense policy put out in 2017 was announced. The Department of National Defense, Canadian Forces were already working on a suite of initiatives that was brought on light with the demographic realities in Canada and how it impacts on the Canadian Forces. The impact of the deficit reduction action program had on the military based on the previous government's priorities. These things were well underway, and so the personnel crisis that exists within the military now is not something that's new because of the pandemic. That it's certainly exacerbated the challenges, but this has been years in the making. And if you're going to have in the kind of environment you have, if you want to optimize the contributions you have, you're going to have a professional military force to be able to do that. And the reality of operations that we're seeing around the world point to that. They point to quality versus quantity. They point to the professional of the class of soldiers, sailors, aviators, representing all of the domains that they work through, and what that brings to the table, the credibility that gives the government in terms of the outcomes it wants to achieve. So if you really want to look at, you know, what should be prioritized, rather than looking at a specific domain, I tell you, it's people right across the domain. And when I was Commander CJOC, visiting some 30 countries, visiting all of our missions in 3 years, wherever they were, I ended every town hall session that I had with a conversation about people, culture change, even back then, maybe not using all the terms we did today, but the importance of driving home change, and just looking at it from a long-term perspective of what we were trying to achieve. And so I would find that if you found one thing that was unifying across all the other initiatives we're talking about, it's people, not just people in uniform. It's capacity of the public service. It's the capacity of government decision-making, right up to cabinet, et cetera. That's the limiting factor in everything we're doing here. I'll leave you with that thought. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Ian, we'll shift to you, and I'm interested to get your take. Obviously, being a distinguished and a long-serving serviceman with the Royal Canadian Navy, and being part of the national shipbuilding strategy, and with Canada in the process of acquiring 15 surface combatant vessels to replace the retired Iroquois class destroyers and the Halifax class destroyers. And then if you see what's going on with our neighbors in the South, with the United States Navy, with the budgets ongoing and going forward, we've seen that the different admirals coming out and saying they need more funds if they're if they want to stay competitive and capable in ensuring deterrence for in the Indo-Pacific, specifically with the People's Liberation Navy. So I just want to get your sense in this. Is it similar to Renee and Steve, or do you have a different take on this?
Yeah. Well, it's slightly different. Maybe I should say that. I'm clearly not a fan of service over service for all the reasons that have been mentioned. Perhaps most importantly, because I have rarely done very much in my career without having another service in support or for another service. I know we talk about joint, and General, you're the expert here, I'm not, but I really have trouble believing that you can prioritize anything in one service and not expect to have to prioritize the other services that will have to be there to allow them to take the lead. And I ain't an operational guy. Where I will go, though, is to say that I worry about Canadian domains, as opposed to services, if you like, having to be able to do everything in the dictionary. When other nations for many years, mostly in Europe, where they're very efficiency conscious, have decided to collaborate significantly in producing not a binational command, Renee, but integrated forces with different nations in almost the same units. And I use as an example, I always like to really upset people. I used to do this in the Navy a lot by being wing nutty like. We have the United States. Why aren't we considering things like co-manning hunter-killer nuclear submarines under our Arctic? Why aren't we co-manning the ballistic missile defense site in Alaska? I could name a number of capabilities that we could be working together with Big Brother to allow us to deliver to them something they desperately need. We talk about the broken Canadian Armed Forces, some people do. I remind people that we're still put rear admirals into RIMPAC as major component commanders in carrier battle groups. We still send CPFs in support of Indo-Pacific exercises and integrated into carrier battle groups. And I'll come back to that point later. My perspective is, I'm not sure, to use the old term, excuse me, General, that armies, navies, and air forces have to be able to do every single piece of the military capability spectrum on their own. Thank you.
Can I respond to
yeah, I'll give you 3 minutes, and then after that we have to move on to the next question.
a quick comment on what Steve said about the importance of people? One of the very clear things that has been communicated by the political level is this, the question of culture change and people, and it's incredibly important. And as Steve said, he's been talking about this for years. I've watched him talk about this for years. But there should be a sobering reminder that the money that comes for people also is the same bucket of funding that is there for operations and modernization. So it's they call it the P-O&M budget, which stands literally for people, operations, and modernization. They are inextricably linked from a funding perspective. So if you're going to spend money, on Oplantis, for example, doing domestic response, you're not going to be training. And so, the priority of the government, as stated and again stated in the budget, was culture change. There is a very real reality here that you have to ensure that the funding is there, because it's all out of the same bucket. It's all out of the same actual funding envelope at national defense. The other thing I would say is that Oplantis is, to Ian's point about not doing everything all the time. Oplantis, the domestic response operation, the name never changes because we're never not doing a domestic response. We're either doing fires in Fort McMurray or floods in Gatineau, where it just never stops. And climate security dictates that it'll only get more the case. Technically, that is a provincial responsibility to respond, but you will never see the Canadian Armed Forces, the CDS, or the Public Safety Minister, the D&D, the Minister of Defense say no to domestic response. What I would say, though, is that we shouldn't have to eat the funding for Oplantis if it's a provincial responsibility. We will never cost recover, we will never ask the provinces to pay us back and cost recover like it says in the books that we should be doing. We'll never do that. But I would say there should be a line item from finance, ensuring that if we're going to be asked to do things, they should be paid to do them. And Oplantis is a good one to square away. It's somewhere between $100 and $300 million, depending on how bad the year has been. But it's something that can be squared away pretty quickly. And so I would just say that those are two very real reality checks and easy fixes.
Perfect. Thank you, Renee. Before we go on to our audience questions, I just want to ask one question, and I want to specify it to Steve because I think he has a good perspective on this, especially with his answer for the previous question. And that's, with finite resources at our disposal, or emerging finite resources, does Ottawa, D&D, politicians, do we need to consider trade-offs for a defense policy update or for any defense policy going forward? In particular, does the CAF need to stop doing, not do, or give up on certain defense and security roles, of which in SSE there are 8 core missions and some 111 specific commitments within the policy? And does Ottawa need to clarify the distinction between Canada's commitments that are vital to our national security versus nice to haves?
It's a great question, but I think, fundamentally straight up front, what's a finite level of resources? We have the 10th largest economy in the world, and our defense commitment isn't commensurate with number 10. And among the G7 nations that belong at NATO, we're well below that bucket. So what is finite? Finite as in terms of this is how much my will indicates, or whether we are capable of contributing as a nation. Land on that over long term in light of what has changed, in light of the government having recognized that things are changed, and consider even things that are changing in the United States. And I've referred to the sort of the chumminess of the conversation, but I was in Washington just after Christmas. One of the speakers that I met was somebody that was knowledgeable about Canada, belonging to a think tank, well connected with the current administration, and yet demonstrated that there are many within that administration that are quite exasperated with Canada's approach. And 2 words came out, and I'm going to use these now to sort of, give you a little bit of thought as to what's going on in the back channels. Those 2 words in reference to Canada were blessed underachievers. Blessed underachievers. And I tell you, that hurt. And so you can imagine, the kind of conversations that are going around to try to determine what is that realistic, probable commitment when we're not even at 1.3%, I think, right now of that NATO target line. So that's point number 1. Secondly, we haven't been doing everything all the time anyway. Like, I can't remember my 35-year career when each of in those domains we were doing everything. We have been relying on allies. We practiced since my days in the Army, part of contribution warfare. We would plug into other formations because there are things we didn't have. Some of those things the government's rushing out to acquire, like air defense, ground-based air defense for land forces, et cetera. But there's a whole host. We don't have the kind of anti-armor weapons that a ground force would need to have a credible deterrent posture on NATO's Eastern Front. So there are things that we haven't been doing. There are things that I could also point to that we haven't been doing, and you raise, people would raise perhaps the point about nuclear submarines and other capabilities. And, without getting into a detailed conversation, there's a whole host of things that the government's already indicated we're not going to do, we're not going to pursue. So that's already out there as part of the conversation. But they haven't really come back and said, with all of this pressure within the context of how their mindset from the time they took power in 2015 through the release of the document to the real world reality check, where I would picture it, I would categorize it as, we no longer see the world as we want to see it, but we now see the world the way that it is. We don't have to be happy about it. We maybe want to change that world. We now recognize that there are things within the world context that have fundamentally altered our orientation and perhaps catching up. So when I look at trade-offs, let me put it another way. Are we going to allow a base to close? We could save lots if we close and consolidate on bases. Are we going to, that level of infrastructure, across the country? We are at once enriched by our geography as a nation, but we're also challenged by it. And the political reality, the amount of ridings all across the country induce a reality into that conversation. So it's very hard for us to sort of find that sweet spot. And I would argue that right now, where we're at is almost at a bare minimum line. Those future conversations are going to be challenging within the environments going forward as to, how do you cover the subsurface domain? And given the lifespan of our submarines and what we would like to do, how are you going to cover the close anti-air domain as UAVs get more lethal and more capability packed into these small platforms, et cetera, et cetera? We're always going to have to find those and make decisions relative to those, and which of our allies can cover those off for us. Are we going to eliminate search and rescue? I think Canadians would be surprised at just how much we devote to search and rescue. There's 1,000 military members a day. At all of the stations across the country, when you consider not just the platforms, the helicopters, but the maintenance, the base staff to go around for the support, the positioning. And if you begin to add that up, that's a solid chunk of change. But are we going to walk back on that? I don't think so.
No.
So yeah, absolutely. So, we probably need to turn it around to say, government, before you get yourselves into a real jammy position here, there is a funding line that you are well below. We don't know necessarily where it is. That's up to you at the political level to figure out and deal with your heads of government of your allied nations where that ought to be. And you've settled on 2% from a NATO standpoint. But right now, there is a delta in between where, clearly we have the capacity as a nation to do more.
And I would add on to that and say it is incredibly important for military leadership and for civilian leadership at DND to articulate exactly where the deficits will come if the funding line isn't met, specifically with detail. I couldn't imagine the 8 missions spectrum of operations in defense policy is even remote. That will not go anywhere. That is what we've committed to doing as a nation. I would feel more comfortable knowing that there's a foreign policy to embed the defense document in, to synchronize it in government's mind. But the 8 missions are not going anywhere. We might not be doing them, obviously, all at the same time. But we do tend to hide behind, I believe, multilateralism is saying, hey, we're part of the team, but it's kind of cover for not being necessarily responsible for outcomes. So we have to hold ourselves to account. And that means speaking truth to power as well.
Perfect. And before we go any further, I just want to ask the panelists if it's all right if we just extend this session for another 5-10 minutes just to cover some of the audience questions.
Of course.
Perfect. Well, we'll get to Renee. I'll ask this then. We have a question from I just need to find it here from Lewis McKenzie, and he's just been asking during his time in uniform. There were up to 93 foreign policies that were, driver defense policies. So he would like to know if the discussion, as we just indicated for defense policy, can it be driven by foreign policy?
Oh, well, I mean, first of all, hello to General McKenzie. It's good to see your name there. I think that foreign policies do have a synchronizing effect on defense policies. It embeds the defense policy and a commitment from the government that this is how we're going to this is how we see and use the Canadian Armed Forces in the bigger picture. I was frankly underwhelmed when we were doing a tremendous amount of work around the defense policy. I mean, we went to cabinet, and I can say this without breaking my oath, a dozen times. There was socialization before cabinet of the defense ask without, breaking cabinet confidence of what the lay of the land looks like. We took our national assessment that we had done and we socialized it to ministers prior to policy to ensure that there's a very realistic view of what the circumstance is. I mean, it was an enormous effort, including the blue ribbon panel we discussed. And again, even if I'm being picky about not having an industry person on that panel, and there was very little discussion as far as the foreign policy is concerned. Chrystia Freeland, as foreign minister at the time, stood up in the House a few days before the defense policy and said, this is our foreign policy statement. As you know, in a few days, the defense policy is coming out. I really think the government must undertake the debate, at least, about whether or not we have a foreign policy. I would completely concur with what Lou is saying there. That does, as I would say, have a synchronizing effect on commitment from government.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you for your comments, Renee. Ian, I'll go to you because you brought up the concept and the subject of nuclear-powered submarines. Wade Moreau would like to know, is Canada's exclusion from AUKUS, the trilateral security pact between the United States, Britain, and Australia, is Canada's absence from that something to worry about? Are we, because we're not in the market for nuclear-powered submarines, What does that mean for our presence in the Indo-Pacific? And then he also brings up the Arctic with China, China equipping and putting funds for icebreakers that are nuclear capable, and their declaration of near Arctic, status. What does that mean for us?
Well, clearly the fact that it happened without, let me rephrase that, without transparency, it looks like it happened, and probably didn't completely, without any consultation with us. It looks like. And I say that because I don't know, and because we're not terribly transparent about these things in our government. Being excluded from anything that involves parts of the Five Eyes is problematic. I mean, we saw this in Spain's, to go back to 2004, the last time I was there, when the government of the US said, we no longer consider, early 2005, we no longer consider Canada a reliable ally. I mean, the number of doors that closed in strange places, and I was in Washington at the time, I couldn't count on hands and feet. So it's always a concern when that happens and we're not part of it. I think AUKUS started around nuclear submarines, which is probably why it may have gotten somewhat off course. I think, I don't know. And the whole issue of the Arctic, if we're not going to be there under ice, the USN is going to be there under ice. Let's not be stupid about this, whether it's China, Russia, or some other strange country. And I mentioned co-manning because, like every other military force in the Western world, nobody can get people anymore to join. Not in the numbers we would like. I mean, General, I think it would be great if they said we need 200,000 people in the Canadian Armed Forces. In what century? So, the US forces have many of the same recruiting problems we do. Many of the same, as do, well, Europe's been having them now for 20 years. So I use the term co-manning simply because I have been at the table in discussions in Washington about another very controversial capability during that period. And had we just said, we'll send you 50 to 100 people to Fort Greely, we'd have been in BMD free. When I was base commander in Halifax, I spent, as did my senior communications folks, a tremendous amount of the time visiting the United States to maintain the fleet's satellite communications and satellite access. And you would know this better than I do, General. So we already have the ability to work very closely with people with tons of resources who give their eye teeth every time we give them support of a Canadian. And we're not using, in my view, those capabilities. And while we're talking about aid to civil powers, I agree with you totally, Renee. And I know we would never want to give up search and rescue, but we had better start to tell the government an appropriate transition to other solutions is necessary, because since World War II, this nation is not interested, short of a world war, I'm really investing more in defense in terms of human capital. which is the most. I'd like to be more positive. I'm sorry, folks. But I lived 25 years in NDHQ. That's why I look like I'm 90. And I have never, ever, ever seen it even sink in the department. Let's remember where all the deputy ministers have always worked. In domestic department focused organization. I'll shut up, Andrew.
Thank you, Ian. Ian, I know you have a hard stop at 5:15 Atlantic Standard Time. So, oh no, sorry, Steve. So, Steve, I'll just direct this question to you. It's from Pierre LeBlanc, and he would like to know what would it take for Canadian politicians to invest 2% or more in defense. And I also just want to add on to that. When we calculate 2% of GDP, obviously there is the NATO substandard, and I think it's going to be more seen as the floor than the roof. But in investing 2% of GDP, does Canada need to prioritize its peripheries? And by that, I mean the Arctic, the Transatlantic, Indo-Pacific, and North America. And if so, would this then influence or maybe change the strategic choices CAF would make in investing its 2% of GDP on defense?
If in the analysis, the course of action dictates that the Arctic needs to be an investment priority because of what's going on, China's aspirations, what the Russians have been doing, then, I would say it's not really a periphery. It's part of, the strong part of strong, secure, and engaged. And so it obviously goes to the fore, no different than NORAD, as part of the secure, but it directly impacts on Canada. So those areas would be investment priorities. And the length of time to do things, though, creates opportunities to do other things concurrently, because everything in the Arctic that you build takes about 4 times as long as something, in the South. And, so to roll out capabilities needs, a timeline and that is more extensive, and we're already late to need. When we talk about the 2%, notwithstanding that I would, as a retired general, I would love to see us clearly spending more, think that we're underachieving as well, and that we need to do it. The 2%, the way it's thrown out there bothers me from time to time, because I as with the experience that I've got, I want to look at capabilities and I want to nest them. I want to get the conversation away from arbitrary things. Because, we have a 25 billion plus liability when it comes to infrastructure within the defense portfolio. Somewhere's north of 20, I said 25, but somewhere's north of 20. That's infrastructure that's falling apart, that's behind guidelines that are commensurate with the rest of civil society, things that need to be implemented. Investing in that, money stays home. We are underpaid. We are undercompensated, notwithstanding the importance of the people side of the equation. There are things that need to be done to support that professional force to get them in. Those things don't necessarily, they give you capability, but not necessarily the same way in an acute security environment. So our conversation needs to be more nuanced. That's only the point that I want to make on that. When it comes to what needs to happen, I think we were close. If the last election in the United States had produced a government similar to the one that we experienced between 2016 and 2020, we'd be having very different conversations today. There's a member of the former National Security Council in that administration, Enbridge Colby is his name, and I haven't read it personally, but there's a blog somewhere where he quoted that it's time, our patience with Canada is running out. It's time to create a strategic shock and get their attention. And given our dependency on the Canadian-American relationship, and if you think about just about everything we do has the U.S. within as the first consideration among everything. You consider areas that are peripheries, and yet we end up in Afghanistan. We end up, doing things in Iraq. We end up doing places because of we prioritize the relationship with the United States. We've been, benefiting from largely benevolent administrations towards their views towards Canada. But one less malevolent could look at, the context of economic and political relations on the continent and do certain things to gain Canadian attention. In that particular post, he was apparently talking about the energy sector as a way of gathering, Canadian attention. I would suggest there's probably other areas, and they're probably looking at it. There are probably people that are doing that. So, we need to be mindful that if the United States is truly our most important relationship. And we can understand the evolution of the last 30 years immediately after the Cold War, a desire to move on to certain things. But the current security environment we're experiencing has been in play, evidenced by intelligence assessments and academics and intellectuals across for at least 10 years. This has been unfolding. Xi took power in 2012. South China Sea started shortly afterwards. The elements of political warfare were announced. He announced a near Arctic nation status, wanted to be a polar power or whatever in 2014. So this is not new. And so one would imagine that at a certain point, the conversation becomes a little bit more acute, a little bit more pointed towards Canada. Where that is, I don't know. As you were talking, posing a question, I was thinking of that Churchillian comment about the United States, that after, pursuing or considering all options, they eventually do the right thing. And so I was wondering, whether or not what the timeline might be for Canada in that regard. But it's not hard to imagine that if a U.S. administration wants to get Canada's attention, there are means to do so. The question is, do they want to go there? So, and that's a ballpark above me.
Renee, we'll conclude with any remarks that you may have. And I feel like you may want to just contribute and add on to what Steve was saying.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Steve is saying. There have been, the Canada-U.S. relationship ebbs and flows. The mill-mill relationship, Canada-U.S., has always been incredibly solid. It's interesting because as co-tenants of the continent, we do have obligations with the United States, but we also do have one of the best relationships in the world that should not be, ignored. When the issue of steel came up, Steve talks about like a shock. Boy, was that a shock to the government that we, at one point, we were being accused of being a national security threat because of a trade dispute. And I have to say that one of the most helpful routes through that time was the defense relationship. Was at the time Jim Mattis and the minister and all mill going down. So it's kind of interesting that it ebbs and flows. But I'm a little bit more optimistic because on defense footing, there is mutual respect. But again, it only goes so far, because and you asked Andrew or Steve, when is the next shock going to come? We can always predict that at the NATO Leaders Summit that we're going to get pressed by the Americans. I mean, Trump leaked a letter on 2% right before we landed at the first Leaders Summit that he was at, that we were at. I mean, we took some punches. I was there. We always get the, démarches when we don't say what we're going to do from the Americans. Example, we said we were going to field a QRF in peacekeeping, and we never fielded that quick response force. The Americans démarched us. They are watching what we do, but there is a very protective element to the relationship that should never, be forgotten. And I'm a little bit, obviously we're a little bit worried about that. I think the four of us are sitting here discussing it. But it would be interesting to see what happens at the NATO Leaders Summit coming up.
Perfect. All right. With that, we'll conclude this webinar. I would like to thank each and every one of you for participating in this panel. Without your insights and your opinions, I don't think we would have had an in-depth discussion on one of the key issues I think are facing Canadian politicians and our national security. I would also like to extend my gratitude to the attendees for joining us this afternoon and for providing their questions that contributed to our discussion. And lastly, I would like to inform our audience and everyone listening or watching that this webinar recording will be published on IPD's website and its YouTube channel. And I also encourage everyone to subscribe to IPD's newsletters and follow IPD on social media for updates on future roundtables. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Andrew.